Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 618, Being Socially Responsible. For Monday, January 11th, 2021. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norton. Thanks for joining us. With all that happened this past week in Washington, once again the focus has turned to the role of social media in both political incitement and the inevitable brand stumbles in responding. Where should social strategy go from here? Tonight we'll discuss. Also, whether social media works for luxury brands, Facebook redesigns brand pages, why you should pretend to like digital, plus this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the president of the 6 Pixels Group, author, speaker, podcaster, Mr. Mitch Joel. Hi, Mitch.
Bobby, how are you doing?
I love it when you do that. Now, next, he's the author of Restoring the Soul of Business, speaker and advisor, Mr. Rashad Tabakawala. Rashad, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me again.
Always a pleasure. And finally, we have the executive vice president of advanced media at Viacom CBS, Mr. Julian Zilberbrand is here. Hi, Julian.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having me back. Wish a happy new year to you and your loved ones. Same for Rashad and Mitch. And hopefully 2020 is the worst year we'll ever face, although so far 2021 I said, hold my drink.
Yeah, I was just going to say, starting up the topics for this week, it was a slow news week. What do you think, guys? I mean, not a lot happened here in the world, except that a lot of things happened. This week has been devastating here in the U.S. And as usual, where the events of the week intersect with marketing falls right at the doorstep of social media and social commerce. Now, despite strong policies and vocal stances against misinformation and hate speech, it took an all-out insurrection for the social nets to respond substantively. Julian, this is a messy, complicated discussion, but where I thought we could begin is with the responses. And I want to start specifically with the responses from the social media platforms. Did any of them get it right? Were any of them moving far enough? It's just like, what's your take on the way that the social media platforms responded to this crisis?
Well, Bob, you're correct in that it's an incredibly messy situation. And if I'm being objective, I think the social networks are functionally in a lose-lose situation, meaning they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. I think, potentially the idea of removing the account of an American president sets an incredible, challenging precedent. And, there are questions about free speech and everything that comes along with it. There's the same, along the same lines.
Well, let's stop there. Let's stop right there before you, because I know there's a lot you wanted to get into, and I don't want to take that away from you. But the idea of free speech, we've said on the program many times that it's not protected speech to be on a private company's platform. And to say that this president has been silenced when he has a media room right in his,
A studio,
studio. Right in his own house. He can go up there and take questions from reporters anytime he wants. It seems kind of ludicrous that free speech should be an issue when it comes to Twitter.
Look, I think on some level, you're right. It's a private company and they have the right to do what they want, and that's fair. On the other hand, I can go into my studio and broadcast whatever I want. Somebody's got to carry that message. If the networks aren't carrying your signal, your message, right, you're not, necessarily interrupting them. There has to be an agreement made for you to go on the airwaves. So I don't know, the studio argument is not necessarily that simple, but look, the bottom line is nobody's going to confuse me potentially for a Trump supporter, but I am objective. And I do believe that there is it's just a complicated situation that I don't think is a simple answer, and for that reason, I think these companies, social media companies, whoever, and the decisions that they had to make, oftentimes you can question those decisions based on any number of factors. I think again, one way or the other, I think it's lose-lose. It's a divided country, so one way you're pissing off half the country, or 55% of it, or 45% of it, one way or the other. I don't know that there's a win here for any of these guys, and I don't know that any of them are in position, or any of us are in position to debate morality any more than anybody else. But I will say that it was a disgrace, obviously, what took place, and I don't know that there's a simple answer that any of these guys can have. But I think for the moment in time, and for the situation that developed in this particular country at this time, and the global impact that anything that happens here, goes and spreads, and what it represents, I think they had to do what they did, and I don't think necessarily it's the wrong thing in my own personal opinion. But I think in general, if you're just looking at it objectively, you could certainly find right and wrong with what they're doing.
Yeah, I look, I'm Canadian, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm definitely not someone who claims to understand the amendments and how they flow, but I can say that the conversation around free speech and censorship in relation to big tech seems very absurd to me, mostly because big tech doesn't win by suspending, deleting, or censoring any content. They win by having as many people as possible on their platform, creating, sharing, connecting, and spending time on it. And that attention and content is the data that makes them powerful. That's where the center of power lies. In fact, I'd argue that blocking anybody, moderating, is the way that they actually lose. It costs them money. It costs them time. It's a huge impact on their human capital, which we've seen as they've tried to ramp up issues related to that as well. And just energy to moderate and deal with content that offends or break laws, or however it happens. And it's not just in the case of the president of the United States. It happens all over the world with other types of activists, and on and on. And I think that the more that people don't connect, or that those connections get broken, the worse the platform actually performs. So if people are questioning the platform, it's kind of crazy to me, because if they leave the platform or go somewhere else or get booted off, it doesn't work in their favor. And we've forgotten that. We've forgotten that prior to all of this, our frustration in the media was that they controlled all of this data and algorithms and content.
No, I'm surprised this
breaks it.
I'm surprised this conversation's going this way, because it's just like there's Twitter specifically has a user policy that Mr. Trump has been in violation of since the very beginning. I mean,
so is the Ayatollah Khomeini. I don't see him getting.
But that's okay. But that's the challenge right there that Julian put forward, is anytime there's an opposition to an individual, it becomes, what about these 5 others before? But I'm with you, Bob.
I've seen some comments from the Ayatollah Khomeini I would very much find offensive.
Well, no, I absolutely agree with you. But Twitter's policy is that a leader of a country represents legitimate news, whether or not he's in violation of the user policy or not. So the Ayatollah would, of course, be granted a special dispensation to be allowed to be on Twitter, the same way that Donald Trump was granted that dispensation.
Yeah, but I think it's the wrong. I think it's the red herring. They don't care. The platforms, big tech, don't care about your content. They just want your data. The content creators are you and I. No content creators, no platform, no growth for big tech. So should they regulate what content we create and put on their platforms? Clearly they should. But at the same time, I do not want a public or private business deciding what is or isn't free speech. That's the role of government. That's the role of law. So we know the rules. We know what's right. We know what's wrong. And yet here we are. We're slamming the platforms that allow this content to flow, and not the content creators for publishing these thoughts in the first place. And this is where the challenge lies.
Rashad, bring some wisdom here on this. What is your thought on this situation?
What does that mean, Bob?
The rest of you have no wisdom. We're going to go to Rashad for that.
Exactly.
Super accurate.
So 2 years ago, I gave a talk to 700 executives, including many folks from Twitter, Facebook, many clients, and I titled it, "It's Time to Optimize for the Citizen and not the consumer. Fundamentally, these platforms, and I agree with Mitch, have optimized for the consumer, which is they've optimized for data because their money is built on selling things. My fundamental belief is that these media are much more powerful than the people who created understand them to be. Because there are two things that work in marketing: emotion and relevance. So if you can micro-target emotion, you can sell things. Now think about politics, micro-targeting and emotion, and you can convince people. And right now, all over the world, but definitely in the United States, between 20 to 40% of the United States, that something that is not true is true. You could not do that prior. And therefore, I believe that this medium has outgrown the wisdom of the people who created it. The answers are not algorithmic because people are emotional. And in effect, for 2 years, 4 years, when this occasionally happened, when Trump got elected, I spoke actually at a Facebook event in February, and I said, you all did this because they were all upset. And I said, hey, by the way, I understand how your medium works better, your platform works better than you all do. You've got to recognize that what has basically happened is we have a platform or platforms that are so overwhelmingly powerful that they can basically both create the good and bad of society. And right now, what people are recognizing is that in the United States, 10 companies can defang, declaw, and completely deposit into nothingness the president of the United States. The 10th company that finally joined them in the party this afternoon was Stripe. No more donations to Trump. 10 companies and you're out.
Yeah, it's hard to have oxygen when they choke the oxygen out of it. And again, to speak to what the question started off as, Bob, and anything Rashad says, I kneel down and I'm compliant to, because I just think he's the smartest person I know. I just think it needs to be highlighted, this idea that any decision to do this, to infuriate 18, 20, 30, 50 million people, whatever it might be, breaks their actual model. It breaks their platform. It breaks everything they're trying to do in controlling all of the flow of content. And so when we look at it from that perspective, we have to know that this is fundamentally a bad move for them to do. They are between that rock and the hard place. This is not the move they want. They want those 20 million people connected. They do not want to break those connections. It is their business.
But that was my point, right? Like there's no win for them, so they lose one way or the other. And I think, honestly, if we're getting to the conclusion that, and I think it's a very fair and rational conclusion that, the power that they maintain has outgrown, their ability to properly, morally manage it, then, the question becomes, who does, right? Because somebody has to. Clearly, there's a management required here, but I don't think anymore that it's in the position or in the hands of any of these individuals who work at these companies to be the morality police as of regards to what does or doesn't go on the platform. Because again, then you run into these simple scenarios where one hate speech is allowed and other hate speech is not.
Yeah, but we're not talking about hate speech here. I mean, we are in a certain sense, but we're talking
insightful speech.
But we're talking about the classic example. You have free speech, but you're not allowed to cry fire in a crowded theater. That's not protected speech. And by saying that the election was stolen from him and that these people should go and march to the Capitol right now, and Rudy Giuliani saying we should give them war, it's just like, this is incitement at the worst level. It's like crying fire in a movie theater. And shouldn't Twitter be responsible? Shouldn't Facebook be responsible? Shouldn't all these companies be responsible for that kind of speech and say this has crossed the line? This has gone too far.
It's their call to make.
Exactly. The companies have to follow the letter of the law. This control of what we read, post, comment on, like, share, the messages that we see, this is on us. The one thing that consumers can control is their knowledge of how media works. They can control their filters. They can control their experience. They can control all that. Expecting to abdicate that while they say whatever they want on those platforms is the highest form of ignorance. You can't sit there and say anything on Twitter and then when it's knocked out, say, well, it's Twitter's fault that all this is happening. At one point, we as adults have to be responsible. And again, if we look at the platform and this platform doesn't create any content, which in particular Twitter doesn't, the people that creating the content is us. And we have to be held to the laws of what is true and real in whatever part of the world you live in. And that's where it has to fall. We need to hold them responsible when things go too far, too long. But beyond that, we create the content. They're not creating the content here.
So essentially what you're saying is that the government as a whole needs to be responsible for Trump's rhetoric, if you will, and has to prosecute if that were allowed, which it's not in the United States while he's president, but should prosecute for the behavior. Twitter shouldn't be responsible. Is that like the consensus that everybody's coming across with?
In as much as the government should decide at what point are they comfortable with, as Scott Galloway calls them, an unregulated monopoly. In as much as that, absolutely. Otherwise, they're going to be free to run and grow how they will.
Well, yes, I'll just build a little bit on Mitch's point, which is, as Mitch has mentioned, what they have had to do has put them in harm's way for two different reasons. One is for the reason that Mitch has stated, which is they lose both users, they lose data, they lose engagement. But the second is they now are confirming what many people have believed, that these are media companies. Right. And the moment you are considered to be a media company, like, let's say, the Wall Street Journal or CNN, you actually have to monitor what's on there. And in effect, the other thing that they have allowed is anyone can say anything. And the problem simply is the people on the other side are not necessarily at any given time sophisticated with what they listen or what they hear. As I explain to people, if you spend enough time in social media, they will make you think your fart smells like Chanel 5.
Absolutely.
So very true.
100%.
So all these companies are jumping on board, and it's not just the social media companies, but the social commerce companies as well. We mentioned Stripe kind of canceling them out, but Parler is being thrown to the wolves, and that comes from Amazon. Amazon's not even going to host them anymore. So unless they find another host, that whole platform is going to be shut down because of the lack of editing or lack of oversight of the conversations going on that platform. We have Shopify cutting out the president and his allies from selling merchandise. At a certain point, where does free speech end and where does commerce begin? In other words, are these companies completely legitimate in making these moves to end providing services like shopping and e-commerce and web hosting? Is that kind of a whole different nut than what we're talking about with the conversations going on the social platforms themselves?
I don't know if it's related to commerce. I would say that it's more related to corporations definitely feeling a level of comfort in showing their values to the world and what they believe to be true and right. And in each instance, I think for every Trump that you eradicate from those platforms that you mentioned, there's going to be dozens, if not hundreds, of issues within that. And we've seen that. We've seen that with Amazon. Every couple months, you get the news release where some third party selling some Nazi propaganda. So this is whack-a-mole at this point. And the only thing they're demonstrating is not e-commerce, but what are the values they want. And to speak to what Rashad was saying, it tackles onto this idea that by demonstrating this, they're choosing a side, which media companies do, right? We know which way the New York Times or the Washington Post leans. Is it left or right? Now we are definitively seeing where these tech companies lie.
to me, to some extent, Mitch, that it feels like a disingenuous morality, because up until January 6th or January 7th or 8th or whenever, Shopify pulled that stuff, I'm sure they were selling tons of it and had no problem doing it. So now all of a sudden, after 4 years of whatever he was saying, now all of a sudden it's gone too far. To me, that's to give certain companies credit for doing this, I feel it was more about political pressure or internal pressure than it was about actually having the value that all of a sudden they're not going to support X, Y, or Z.
I agree with you 100%, Julian. 100%.
But is it the same thing as what the social platforms are doing? Is it muzzling speech? Is it somehow
it's the same principle as far as I'm concerned. You let it fly until at some point the pressure was to shut it down, right? And then after that, now it's just public pressure or whatever it is. And if the pressure was in the other way, they wouldn't have done it. I don't know. It's why I think it's a tough question. I think it's a lose-lose scenario, and I don't think that there's an easy and simple answer that they did the right thing or not the right thing, because your opinion on this is
I'm not trying to get to a morality understanding of this problem. I'm trying to get to a legitimate understanding of whether or not this is acceptable. You guys all made the case that it's a lose-lose situation for the social networks, and that essentially it is tamping down on free speech and that it needs to be allowed to flow. Whereas when we're talking about e-commerce, like Shopify, or whether or not a site should be allowed to be hosted on a server, isn't that a whole different thing? I mean, a business can choose to do business with whoever it wants to do business with.
It's extremely problematic. And I think Julian is correct in that it becomes more press and media than a function of how they operate. Because if that were the case, we're going to go down the line and ask, well, does the White House use Microsoft products? We're going to shut them out of Word and Excel. Do they search on Google? We're going to shut them out of. It becomes very, very problematic to the questions you're asking. So the one hand of this, of at least from my perspective, is this media, big tech, social media platforms. The other side is this extension of it, this Stripe, this Shopify, this AWS, where it becomes extremely problematic. And I don't know that it falls under the same umbrella as the social media platforms.
Well, I'll just build on this. And underlying this is something that, even though I went to the University of Chicago, which loves competition, and in fact, they love competition so much that the University of Chicago truly believes that all these companies need to be broken up, which is what I believe. Because when we mention all these different companies, it comes down to the same 10 companies across. It's across everything. So if you basically think about Amazon, right? Amazon, Microsoft, and Google means everything with the cloud, and let's throw in Apple. So Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Apple. Every single thing with the cloud.
Don't forget IBM in that mix as well, but the point is well taken.
Yeah, everything with regard to app stores, right? Now basically throw in a Facebook, throw in a Twitter, throw in a Stripe, throw in a Square, and a couple of other companies. You pretty much have a Shopify, and you've got everything with regard to commerce. You have 10 companies that control the Western ecosystem. That's never happened before.
Yeah, and to make it crazier, you want to make everybody crazier, the tech people who really believe in this stuff, the only place that these companies will find salvation is the open web, and that's where the deep irony lies.
Yeah, good point. Hey, the one last point I wanted to do on this subject before we move on is how brands responded. There's always that question of how does a brand respond in this certain situation? And I'm talking about the brands who are on the platforms, not the platforms themselves. Axe body spray, apparently an Axe can was left at the site of the riots, and Axe felt compelled to get on there and disavow the use of their product by these people. Is that even worth the effort anymore? I mean, I understand that cancel culture, being what it is going to slam any brand that's associated with these individuals. But is it still necessary to be so responsive, or should you just let it blow over? What's your guys' take on that?
We didn't see Kylie Jenner stuffing a rose into anyone's gun at the Capitol Hill. We didn't see that. No, okay.
No, we did not. We did not.
It's simply a sign of the times that we're in. With the volume of potential, coverage or press or anything that goes about it, and you mentioned cancel culture or whatever anybody wants to call it. I think people, or companies might feel the need to have to react just to, position themselves however they think the PR maven says at that point in time. The reality is I can't imagine, if I was a Democrat and all of a sudden I saw an Axe can, in a video that in a photo of the Capitol siege, and all of a sudden I'm against Axe. Like, you'd have to be a little on the wrong side of sane to really kind of think that way. But
have you not been paying attention to social media for the past 10 years?
In fairness, no, I hate social media. I try to avoid it, but look, I don't think brands have to do it, but I think at some level there's a PR director somewhere that feels compelled to.
Does social strategy need to evolve in any way in light of what happened last week? Does social need to, the social managers out there, do we need to rethink how we go about doing social, or is this just a blip on the radar and it's not really going to affect anything in the way that we do business on social media?
In general, I would argue that they're getting better at pausing campaigns, staying out of it. Unless the brand is really known to be cynical or sarcastic, a little bit dark, probably stay away from it, because the intended execution of it will probably be taken in a myriad of ways. The way that social has evolved and the way the conversation and content has evolved, it would be best from my perspective for them to take a little bit of a step back. And in all fairness, I actually think we saw that quite a bit. If you were really looking at your feed, you probably noticed there were a little bit less ads. So I'm sure some campaigns were paused and put on hold. It's the nature of the business. Also, let's be honest, we're in the middle still of a global pandemic. Let's not forget that. And most agencies are feeling a bit of that pinch and probably would have a nice moment in time to take a break from spending, because it might help them a little bit as well, which we've seen happen. And it wouldn't be uncommon for it to be happening right now. So I personally didn't see any major flubs during this or any mismanagements, and I'm sure we'll see in the coming weeks if it changes.
I think one of the things to also note is some companies are now starting to think about who they're funding. So, for instance, Marriott today announced that they are withdrawing any kind of financial support for any politician who voted against accepting that Biden had won the election. That was number one. You saw that the 2021 or 2022 big golf tournament, which is supposed to be at one of Trump's resorts, said it's not going to be there. So what you are going to basically see is, when everything is said and done, what counts and what votes in the United States is money. And you're going to see business swinging money in ways that will force politicians to behave, because business is moving much faster than politicians can. And because business funds the politicians, I would basically say follow business, do not follow the politicians.
That's a really fascinating take on this. And it makes a lot of sense. It's kind of a duh. Of course, that's the way it should be. But it does make a lot of sense that follow the money. It's always been the rule of thumb. If money is against you, you're not going to win in politics. And the corporations are the power centers of all the financial capital in the world. So,
well, speaking to what Rashad said, you've got 10 companies that control it all. Just think about the chest puffing that's going on right now on Capitol Hill. If you want to control or change policy now, you can essentially demonstrate as a corporation that you can take the oxygen out of the room of anyone's voice. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
It is. And it's one of the reasons why I think people have underestimated that the two most powerful things that were actually done by companies were what was done by Shopify and Stripe, much more than whatever Facebook and others did. Because in effect, it basically impacts cash flow, which is the blood that keeps this thing going. Once you start impacting cash flow of Fox. Once you start employing, that's when Murdoch changes. All of these people are money tropic. That's all that they are. They are money tropic. They are not principle tropic, moral tropic, nothing tropic. Money, and then to a certain extent power, but that comes from money. That's it. Period. Over and out. So if you can control the money, you control them.
Rashad's always smarter.
Yeah, that is. It's incredibly inherently upsetting and wrong that we are talking about corporates' influence on our political system. That in and of itself is the problem. And the fact that we can all agree very much so that there are 10 companies, and let's include the Halliburtons of the world and some other pharmaceutical companies in the mix there that are driving the good and the bad and the quote unquote morality of government. And so until we can remove dollars out of our system, then what Rashad says is accurate, is the money's going to drive what the motivation is.
And look, how long did we talk about brands and owning your own property, owning your blog, owning your newsletter, owning the list, owning the website, and not being on these rented places of social media? If you ever wanted a microcosm, which became a macrocosm example of it, take a look.
Truth.
If the Trump administration had built all communications through text messaging, newsletters, going to the website, his own video platform within that, this would just be a minor distraction that you could swat away. But literally, as Rashad said, as Julian said, they choked the oxygen out of the business.
Well, also, let's not fool ourselves. If you don't think that there's going to be, a television network and a social media network and everything else that comes out with, that level of spin for those individuals, that's good. That's 100% happening.
It's going to be harder to find the pipe, though. It's going to be harder to find the pipe to put it through.
Yeah, and it's going to be harder to find the money to make it happen, which again goes back to where the money's going to go as a result of this.
There's always money, gentlemen. Come on.
Always money in pipe. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
money and pipe.
The trouble for social didn't stop with amplifying sedition this past week. The social marketing world was rocked when luxury brand Bottega Veneta closed all of their social media accounts. Now, Rashad, let's start with a top-line question. Do you think this is a stunt, or is this a serious move on their part?
I think it is a very serious strategic move, which is very aligned with their brand and with actually a sophisticated understanding of how to use social. And the way to use social is not to use it directly. That's what the sophisticated people begin to understand.
Now, what do you mean by that? Explain that.
What I mean is that if you think about what actually works is on the first thing they did, obviously, if it was just a stunt, they would be very happy with all the PR that they got.
Yeah.
So there is, there are two conversations. One is they did this to get the PR, and the other is they did this to mimic music stars who often clean out their social feeds before they launch a new album.
Right. All right. I was reading that. Yeah.
And so the whole idea is, okay, I've cleaned it out because I'm going to launch in March or April my 2021 collection. But instead, think about it as something different. If you believe, as I believe, that Facebook and Google is a tax on every business, it's not a differentiating property anymore. That if you aren't using Facebook or Google or Amazon or other places, you suffer. But it's not differentiating. They basically take a large portion of your business because most companies have not started, direct-to-consumer relationships or other things that span. So in effect, they basically said, playing doesn't differentiate us, and we want to differentiate. Now, look at the fact that it's one of the few brands in the world that does not have a logo that they actually put on their bags or on any of their, any of the items they produce. The only thing they have is the interweave. So the entire idea basically is, could we basically have people whispering and talking and advocating, sort of like, a special club? So in effect, they have sort of decided, and I think what they will do is, not that they won't come back, but what they will do is they will feed a combination of influencers, special events, very much like they're doing their own exhibitions or rather their own fashion shows. If you know, this is a company that doesn't stream nor do major fashion shows. They do small little events, and then they let the exclusivity and the secrecy of it spread. So they have figured out that the way to be everywhere is to be rare.
Mm.
Yeah, and I love that so much, because the world of luxury is one from a marketing perspective that I spend a lot of time and attention looking at. And there are layers within luxury. There's retail luxury, there's airport luxury, and then there's the rarefied air of luxury that this brand and others, if you look at some of the major higher end watch manufacturers as well, occupy. And the idea is they really don't need that many people. It's about who. And the who, based off of where they sit in that thin layer of rarefied air of luxury, they know, they have relationships with. You can walk down
like
Fifth Avenue
podcasting.
and see a lot of these stores that aren't open ever. It's by appointment only. How do they occupy all that real estate? They know exactly who's coming in, when, and for what. And if we flip our thinking as marketers and think about it from this world of how much more scarcity can we inject into that brand, this is where that level of luxury thrives. I agree 1,000,000% with what Rashad is saying.
You know, bringing that point to the forefront, then the move here has brought the fact that many luxury brands are privately skeptical already of social, and that social dramatically underperforms expectations. And there's a lot of speculation about whether other luxury brands will kind of take a wait and see attitude or kind of just follow suit because they're unhappy with social performance. And I'm wondering, is social good for luxury brands? Is it certain luxury brands like Bottega that is, you know, kind of in that rarefied stratosphere of the top of luxury? Is it better for them and not so necessary for the lower end luxury brands? I mean, I'm trying to get a feel for who should be off social media and following suit with them, and who needs to continue to work with social media platforms.
So I think my basic belief is that you cannot be a successful brand today without participating in some way, either overtly or covertly, with social media, right? Because more and more people are utilizing it, but there are different flavors of social media. I believe, for instance, Instagram is the next Condé Nast. Condé Nast should have basically launched an Instagram. But Twitter is not necessarily built for luxury. Facebook, questionable whether it's built for luxury, right? WhatsApp, probably not built for luxury at all. Pinterest might be on a particular day, right? TikTok, possibly. And so what tends to basically happen is also now there are significant flavors of social. You have to be on Instagram, but you don't necessarily have to be there directly. You could be there covertly. Or you can make a strategy that your strategy of social is not to be on social, which happens to be a social strategy.
Yeah. Let me ask a question. Let me ask a question real quick, though, of you, Rashad. When we're talking about which platforms are better for luxury than others, isn't that just a matter of who your friends are? Because social media on Facebook is a lot different for somebody who's on there with $1 billion in the bank than it is for me sitting around here in my closet doing a podcast. I mean, I'm still a luxury buyer, but I mean, I can see why Facebook wouldn't work for me, but would it work better for an audience if it was rarefied in that way?
No, see, I think luxury basically is high on image and feeling and low on words.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and Instagram is high on visual, low on words. So the more you have it visually driven, which is really, if you think about, a Vogue magazine, I mean, people don't read Vogue for the words. They look at it for the pictures.
Yeah, good point. Good point there. Sorry to interrupt you.
And I also think that when you have the influencer model, there are certain brands that do exceedingly well when they're being whispered about. And these brands do that exceptionally well. And again, when you know the players and you know the people, even the influencers themselves, when they have an attachment to a brand at that level, they know to whisper and not scream about it. And that creates its own strategy, as Rashad said.
I think the smartest thing they could do is redistribute that money to fantastic targeted television, broadcast CBS, or they're more than happy. We should send them a nice influencer program, which I'm sure if Bottega's interested, we could talk through as well.
Exactly.
Hey, I wanted to mention, Julian, too, if you might want to reseat your microphone in the plug because you keep coming in and out. So it might be a bad port or something. So try that again. But yeah, this is an interesting subject to me, this whole thing about luxury brands and social media. I think that we got to a really good place on it. So I'm just going to move on at this point. Facebook has ended the brand page like in a revamp of all their pages. Now, apparently, Mitch, there are lots of tweaks, including an improved news experience, a graphic distinction between page owners and page administrators, and of course, the removal of the like function, which is the most controversial move. Does any of this really improve the Facebook page experience? Is it a good move on their part, and will it make? I guess it's obviously designed to make the job of a social page administrator easier, but will it be better for users, and will it actually be something that brands can use going down with the metrics that are being proposed?
It just seems overall like Facebook doesn't seem to think this is all that big of a deal. And I'd argue that if you look at the reaction to this, it doesn't necessarily feel like brands see this as that big of a deal. And I think that's because if you have somebody following you, let's call them a customer, even if they haven't bought from you, there's a value to that over a simple impression, or that would be a like. And this idea that perhaps if you're going to be building some form of community and some form of content marketing within these Facebook brand pages, that you really want to focus on the content and the interactions over the likes and the clicks. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, Bob, you've known me a long time, Rashad's known me a long time. I live and breathe that. It's not about how many, it's about who. It's not about casually popping in and just hitting a like because you're thumbing through it in a feed. It's, did someone leave a comment? Did somebody take that piece of content that you created and share it and talk about it in their own and different way? So from that perspective, I actually think this could be some kind of pathway forward that, hazard to say this after the first segment that we talked about here, might be great to see happen also on everyone's pages.
You know, I always go back to an example that was given to me by one of the clothing brands. I guess it's kind of low-level luxury. But it was a shoe company, and they talked about the fact that they lost a major contract with one of the major department stores because another shoe manufacturer had more likes on their Facebook page. And for me, that always resonated because the like is meaningless. We've all come to that conclusion years and years ago at this point, that the like is basically meaningless. But it's not meaningless when a company decides whether or not to go with one shoe manufacturer or another shoe manufacturer based on how many fans they have. And I'm wondering if that metric being lost is actually going to be detrimental for some companies.
But think about it more in the way of being able to see actually how many people are following and then how many people actually interact versus this terrible metric of the like, which again, if you are a social media manager and you got to make your bones and you want to look good, you're going to say we got 3 billion likes or whatever the number is, which in relation to how many people are there, how many people are actually interacting with this, what is the actual value? What is the financial value of creating a piece of content on Facebook? You're going to tell me 50 likes? It's a terrible metric. But if we've got more people now following, more people engaged with this content, I believe the removal of it will shift the focus into the area that matters most when it comes to the content creation side of social.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this? Because I'm completely conflicted about this. I think Mitch makes a lot of great points, and I agree with him that, you know, the level of interaction is much more important than the like. But it comes down to a dollar and cents question. If your customers, and your customers are not your end users in this case of my example, but your retail buyer, your retail partner, I mean, if they're looking for one metric and they can't find that metric, does it hurt business in the end? I mean, Rashad, do you want to weigh in on that?
I actually, I agree with Mitch, because my sense is if you think about people now, most of them who are now using these platforms are trying to see if it generates something lower funnel rather than upper funnel. And to me, the like is the upper funnel. The lower funnel is, do they get a lead? Do they get a sale? Do they get a walk into the store? On our earlier topic, because I tried to read about why luxury thought that social media was not working, they were evaluating social media not as Vogue magazine. They were looking at social media as direct mail marketing.
I mean, why do this stuff if there's no true economic value to it? And a like is not even pennies worth.
Yeah.
I think that's the important point, is this is a way to kind of game the algorithm towards a different performance metric.
Well, I want to move on to the final topic before we run out of time. It's getting late in the show. Mark Ritson, somebody who I really need to reach out to and get on the show at some point, but he penned an opinion piece last week asserting that the ubiquitous emphasis on digital marketing and job descriptions, even for more general marketing positions, is leading to a disingenuous embrace of digital in the industry at the same time that digital effectiveness is seriously coming into question. Mitch, is the criticism valid, and do we need to address it? What do you think?
I mean, Mark is brilliant, and the article is fantastic because it is part comedy and theater of a Q&A that would happen if you went in for a job interview, and the questions, which seem somewhat pedantic versus thinking about things strategically versus what is the execution. And that's the 30,000 foot view of what Mark is saying, that when you ask specifically about digital marketing, you're moving into tactics and you're not thinking at a strategic level of what's best for the brand or the outcome that needs to happen. Now, with that, my pedigree came in 15 plus years of running a digital agency in that space. And where I sit now, being 6 years since I sold the business and 2+ years that I've been out of the agency business, is that enough businesses are still very shallow in this space that we very clearly defined in the first segment is going to be able to really suck the oxygen out of the room for you if they want to. And what's happening is the C-suite and the board are asking these questions because they have been seen or have felt that they've been flat-footed or out of step. It's an uncomfortable place to be. And so this desire at a senior, at a middle, at an entry level to really bring in people who get digital is, I still believe, a valid question, line of questioning, or even area that you might want to occupy. So I looked at it and I laughed and I thought, it is true. It's all about the strategy, not the execution. But ultimately, if you're bringing in people who have little experience with it, it's going to be problematic because the hill is much steeper. There is more data, there is more technology, there is more math involved than the old way of doing it, and maybe removing the planner side of it. And why this is important is because you have a senior group of people in the marketing industry that are being exposed to it and drinking from the fire hose, as it were. And then on the younger side, there's this expectation that they're young and they get that. And I can tell you, as someone who's hired hundreds, if not thousands of people throughout my career, that just because somebody knows how to turn on a light switch, it doesn't make them an electrician, right? Just because they know how to post and look good on social, it doesn't mean they understand the business mechanisms that will make it work for a brand. So I'm not dissing what Mark wrote. It's clever, it's smart, it's true. That being said, we are in a world where the supply and the demand of the needs of this particular skill set are still not equalized.
So I read the article. It was funny. I will just I'll agree with Mitch, and I'll expand on it a little bit. I took it as reading it to speak to some of the inherent ageism that I think exists in our industry. And I think Mitch was touching on it a little bit, to the extent that if somebody's young that it's coming in, then they're going to assume there's a digital native. And that if it's a senior role and you have somebody coming in who's maybe a little on the older side, the expectation is they're used to working in more old school media types, and therefore they're not going to be digitally savvy. And instead, they need to find ways to show their digital chops, because otherwise they seem old and out of touch. So to some extent, I think that's incredibly accurate and a very good representation of where the industry is in terms of how it looks at people who have some experience, who oftentimes, to the article will have some of that more strategic perspective versus tactical, and the delineation between them not necessarily being understood by the people asking the questions.
The one angle of this story that I think we're not addressing, though, is the fact that there is a kind of a massive questioning of the effectiveness of digital, and largely driven by the fact that so much fraud is going on, so much ad fraud. I mean, Uber talking about, just slashing and getting rid of most of their digital budget and having absolutely no loss in revenue from the result of it. I mean, they were getting the same results, but because they took control of it and spent a lot less money.
But that could be less about the volume of dollars they were spending versus how they were spending it.
Right, and so it is.
50 or 60% of my investment in programmatic, and I don't know where that dollars are going, and I don't know where I'm running. Of course, you're going to run into some stuff.
And what I'm saying, though, is that as a result of that, there is more need for somebody to have digital chops, whether you're doing a traditional marketing role or a digital marketing role, because of things like that. The knowledge of where you're spending your money and how you're spending your money is more important than understanding the tactic itself. I mean, just knowing what the results are. And it seems like that's something you don't get to with just strategy. You get to that with digital strategy, with digital understanding, with the mechanics there. And so, of course, brands are more interested in bringing digital experts in. It's not to bring about more digital marketing. It's to be smarter about digital marketing. Am I right about that?
It feels like it's the paradox of the article, which is if you had done it right, you wouldn't have wasted that $100 million Uber. And perhaps you have a slew of employees who are being compensated in the wrong way to be successful. This is, again, you talk about the profound beauty of what digital can do, especially with a product like Uber, and it's almost nonsensical. I don't blame the platforms or anybody else but the employees and the tactics they decided to execute on. I think this is just a case of them not being good at this.
But I think the article was kind of digital is a tactic within a grand scheme of marketing. How you technically leverage that tactic, whatever you're doing, whether you're buying, video banners, social, whatever, that's the understanding, that's the expertise that comes as a marketer versus it being an individual tactic and the only approach with which you have to try to reach consumers. And I think the point at least I got from it is, oftentimes the tactic and the general overall understanding of marketing and strategy are often conflated.
Yeah, it's like, what is a skill or what is the vocation? I agree.
Well, with that, it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Mitch Joel. You can find him at 6pixels.com. That's the home of his blog and his podcasts and his books, and you can find out all kinds of information from the 6 Pixels website. So tell us, what's going on in your world, Mitch? What would you like to promote?
I'm just so excited to have spent any amount of time with Rashad Tabakawala. I'll tell you that every Sunday, which is when we're recording, I cannot wait to get his newsletter, which he does on Substack. So I will abdicate my moment to pass it to him to tell you what the URL is for his Substack. Because if you like this show and you like the space and you're not reading Rashad's weekly musings, you don't know what you're missing.
Good point. So let's go to Rashad next, to Rashad Tabakawala. I'm not sure where we can find you these days. You've got a website, I'm assuming. So tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote?
So I'd like to promote the fact that Mitch is an amazing person who has
come on now,
who has very good taste. You could basically, for the newsletter that I write, which has been very popular, and I spend a lot of time writing it, though it takes only 6 to 8 minutes to read every Sunday, is at rishad.substack.com. That is rishad.substack.com. And pretty much everything else that you need to know about or see about me is simply at rishadtabakawala.com. And thank you again for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. Absolutely. And last but not least, Julian Zilberbrand. You can find him at a little media company called ViacomCBS.com. So tell us, what's going on in your world? What would you like to promote, Julian?
Well, listen, of course, I'll jump on the bandwagon and promote Rashad. Definitely everybody should, read what the gentleman writes, and it was an honor to get to share a company with him for over a decade. Otherwise, I'll promote what I always promote. Please watch some broadcast television, some cable television. If you like it on OTT, feel free to download our streaming apps, CBS All Access or coming Paramount Plus, Pluto TV. But hey, if you've been watching the NFL today and had an opportunity to watch the games on Nickelodeon, know that that's going really, really well and people love it. And it's a great way to expose your kids to the game. So whether you're watching the NFL on CBS or Nickelodeon, I suggest you watch it and find ways to help me feed my children.
I would also add, let me add one more thing for Julian. Is Star Trek Discovery is incredible, so thank you.
Awesome. We got more coming, I'm sure.
As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. And of course, you can find out how to advertise on this program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul, a rundown of the best and worst of advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. First up, my fair of the week is kind of an unconventional one. I was pretty excited to see that Adweek acquired Social Media Week. Now, Social Media Week being the conference, not another magazine. And Rashad, I don't know about you, but I feel like this is going to be good for Social Media Week to be aligned with what I think is one of the best marketing magazines out there. I mean, I've sort of become a convert to Adweek over the other publications that are on the market. What do you think?
I completely agree. I believe that this is very good for Toby Daniels, his co-founder, and the rest of the team. And what they have basically needed is the other side, which is the ability to take some of their amazing content and their relationships and be able to scale it. And this is particularly what Adweek has done. And Adweek clearly has become, I think, they have began to eclipse Ad Age, which has, for some reason, decided to almost sunset itself in very strange ways, including the way they use the web. They seem to be very caged, is the best way to say it.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's been difficult to work with Ad Age, basically do all my research for the shows and stuff like that. It doesn't feel like it's as newsworthy as it once was. So, but this isn't to criticize Ad Age. It's just to say, Adweek, you're doing a great job. So thank you very much.
And congratulations to Social Media Week, because they do good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, the fail for this week, I'm going to give to Indian company Adani, who pulled ads for a rice bran oil that they make featuring heart-healthy claims after an endorser in the ad suffered a heart attack. Mitch, I know this is one of the things where you can't really blame anybody for this, but it is kind of funny that they were getting trolled as a result of this.
The good news, there's no good news here. The good news is that, as we said earlier, it was a slow news week and it's going to go out with a whisper, not a bang, I promise.
And of course, the foul for this week, Julian, goes to the Kelly Loeffler Senate campaign in Georgia. That's Georgia, the United States, not Georgia off there in the Asia.
Former Russian Republic?
Former Russian, that's what I was looking for. I was going to say Russia, and I'm like, nope, that's not right. Don't be saying that.
Breakaway Russian Republic, Georgia.
Well, the Kelly Loeffler campaign ran ads that featured Raphael Warnock, her opponent, with his skin darkened, which is an old trick. I mean, I can't believe they're still doing this. And it's just like, Republicans, you got to get off of this trend. This is not a good way to market yourself. Totally gets the foul for me.
Yeah, there's really nothing positive to say about that scenario, using any kind of, race baiting kind of scenario to promote, any agenda is functionally pathetic and unacceptable. So shouldn't happen here, and it shouldn't happen ever.
Well, have a suggestion for this list or just want to discuss it? Comment online using the hashtag #FairFailFoul. That's #FairFailFoul. And that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
Like, you know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. Just like, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.